Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I want to talk to you today about quite a small area of the East Midlands known as the Leicestershire Wolds. It's just to the south of the Nottinghamshire boundary, a largely rural area, although there are villages around the edges. There are actually 8 parishes making up the Leicestershire Wolds. They form this roughly circular arrangement, so all coming together at the middle, a bit like slices of the pie. Clearly there's a bit missing to the right, something has been chopped out, and a bit on the left has been extended, and I'll explain why that a little later. Running almost north-south is this almost straight line, which is the modern road, the A46, known to the Anglo-Saxons as the Fossway, and it's basically the Roman road that's running out from the West Country, Cirencester, all the way up through Warwickshire into Leicester, and then through the Leicestershire Wolds, heading northwards, first to Newark and then to Lincoln. Quite a major road. You can see that there's 8 parishes. A little bit in the middle, it's up until the late 19th century, was extra parochial. That's known as 6 hills, although there aren't any hills there at all, let alone 6. It's almost like a little plateau, the top, the highest point, but more like a plateau. And there are actually 9 settlement names, if you count them up, starting on top right. There's Old Dolby, Ragdale, Thrussington, Seagrave, Walton-on-the-Wolds. Both Prestwold and Burton-on-the-Wolds share the same parish. Prestwold probably was never much more than a small settlement at best. Burton-on-the-Wolds is the newcomer. That place name tells us that it was founded quite recently, the 9th century actually. I'll come back to that a little later. And then north of there is Wymeswold and Willoughby-on-the-Wolds. What does the word wold mean? Well, it actually comes from an Old English word, wold. It means woodland or high forest land, and it's the same word that can be found in the Cotswolds, in the Lincolnshire Wolds, and spelt and pronounced a little differently, the Weald in Kent and Sussex. It comes from a German word, wold, which also means woodland. It acquires the sense of a large area of woodland with small clearings and fields in the midst of the wood, but the sense of the word changes over the years. These days there is very little woodland around the Leicestershire Wolds, and most of that has been planted comparatively recently, but clearly at the time it was given the name, which is going to be somewhere around the 6th, 7th century, and there was fairly extensive woodland in this relatively high area. So, what are we looking at here? Well, clearly the blue is the local streams, one of them starting at 6 Hills, the other one starting not very far away to the west. The green splodges are modern villages, all sitting around the edge of the Wolds, and that's for a good reason, because the yellow line is a 300-foot contour, approximately 100 metres. Any land inside that is just slightly above 300 metres, and the streams drain away, and predictably enough the villages are on the spring lines and so forth. The orange lines are the roads, clearly the Fossway, which I mentioned, running north-south. Running from the southwest to the northeast is another Roman road coming out of Barrow-on-Soar, which is the green splodge bottom left, actually sits at the side of the River Soar. And it crosses the Fossway at 6 Hills and heads off to the northeast to the village of Eastwell, on a very high ridge of ground that drops away very dramatically to the north, down into the Vale of Belvoir. Then that Roman road takes a sharp turn right and goes down towards Glebe Marwood, where in both Iron Age and Roman times there was extensive iron ore extraction and iron working. So the other roads there are comparatively modern roads associated with the formation of the villages, or even with changes in farming practice around the 18th century. So when did these green spots appear? When did those villages appear? Well, we know in general that nucleated settlements, as we call them, start somewhere around the 8th to 11th century, and I'm going to sort of home in for convenience on around the 10th century. Prior to that, people were living in dispersed farmsteads, multiple generation farms, probably with 3 generations living in the same area, and these were, in this part of the world, we think about 1 kilometre apart, and they would obviously be farming the fields in their immediate vicinity. But for reasons that are not fully understood, that all changes and everybody gets together in these nucleated settlements, as we call them, villages as we now think of them. And somewhere, I say, around the 10th century, we refer to parishes, which usually have the same name as one of the villages. Parishes are actually something later still. They come after nucleated villages and they're only beginning to come into existence around the 10th, 11th century. They have a particular reason, and that is because at this time the idea of using tithes to fund the parish church, as it was becoming, all starts to become part of the fashion. Prior to that, there were different ways of funding churches. Once you've got to pay tithes, you need to know which church the tithes are paid to. You really don't want to be paying them twice. And so parish boundaries become established in a way that they were not really needed to quite the same extent before. But these 8 parishes as a whole form a circular land unit which is clearly straddling the Fosse Way and the other Roman road, and we have to think of that unit of land as dating back before the Romans, and therefore Iron Age or possibly Bronze Age. And clearly it's topographically defined. It's all this area that's around 300 feet above sea level, just rising slightly higher. So it's a unit, and these 8 slices of pie are chopped out of it, presumably around the 10th century. Now, there's something special going on right at the north of these 8 parishes, right on the boundary with Nottinghamshire, and that is a Roman small town. 10 miles from Leicester, 10 miles from Margidunum, exactly where you'd expect a Roman small town to be placed. But this one has got an interesting name, Vernametum. The Nemeton would be a sacred grove, and the Vern part tells us this is the especially sacred grove. And so what was going on here? Well, that name must refer to something that was there before the Romans, so it's an Iron Age sacred site. Quite what made it special, we're not quite sure. Whether the shrine itself was where the Roman small town is, probably not. The Romans probably did not build a town straight on top of a very important regional sanctuary. So the Nemeton was somewhere nearby. Now, we can make a number of guesses as to where it is, but the most logical suggestion is that it was at the centre, or near the centre, of these 8 parishes, as we now think of them, which would put that Nemeton at or around the 6 Hills crossroads, where the 2 Roman roads cross. We can't prove that. There's been too much development in that area with roads and buildings to ever come across the sort of faint chances of the especially sacred grove. There is other Iron Age evidence in the area, and just occasional scatterings of pottery. This was a nearly complete beaker which was found upturned in a very shallow ditch, and there it is towards the bottom of that photograph in the late 1980s, when some houses were being built to the east of the village of Wimswold, and for about 3 days the developers allowed the local archaeologists to investigate what turned out to be a couple of ditches, one late Iron Age, one very early Roman, with assorted finds. In more recent years there have been additional Iron Age settlements discovered in Burton, again in advance of housing construction. The presence of this Roman small town would have distorted the local farming. We can assume that this upland area, possibly wooded around this time, was not prime agricultural land by the standards of the region. But because the Roman small town would not be self-sufficient, it would rely on food produced in the immediate area. It would also be a place for trading food, with people travelling up and down the Fosse Way and so forth. It would have a distorting effect on the farming, both arable and pastoral. One of the small fragments of pottery that was discovered at Wimswold in the late 1980s was actually got these holes in it. The actual fragment of pottery has since been lost, but these small holes tell us it was the bottom of a small cheese press, possibly for cheese made from sheep's milk rather than cow's milk. So the farmers in Wimswold, what is now Wimswold, would have been turning their milk into something they could have traded further afield, and possibly quite easily have traded at the small town at Vernametum. Other evidence of the Romans living there was fragments of brooches. This is a fairly typical design of Roman brooch, and there's drawings of 2 more that were found in what was a fairly small area of excavation. I say these 2 truncated ditches. Now, as history books tell us, the Romans basically left British Isles very early in the 5th century. So what happened to the Leicestershire Wolds then? Well, frankly, we don't know. I mean, there's almost no archaeological evidence, or certainly no written evidence, but we can make some fairly intelligent guesses. There was clearly a lot of farming going on in that area, and we do have the archaeological evidence for that in forms of distributions of pottery fragments that suggest manuring scatters, so most of the Leicestershire Wolds was probably ploughed at some time during the Roman period, although not necessarily under the plough all at the same time. There would have been areas that would have been fallow or used for animal grazing, then reverting back to arable land. The big clue is this name, the Wolds. It does suggest that by the time the Anglo-Saxons were settling, then this area had reverted to woodland, and that's entirely plausible because trees actually grow fairly rapidly. This is a photograph that I took in 1991. You can actually see in that photograph the concrete post, which is the Ordnance Survey trig point. So prior to these trees being planted, this was an area with very open views and quite distant views, otherwise you wouldn't have put a trig point there. And within a few decades, then those trees have clearly grown. I've been unable to locate the trig point since. It might still be there, but it's certainly well overgrown. So we can see that well within a generation, tree cover can be established, and whilst this was almost certainly planted, nevertheless the sort of trees which are planted there are the sort of trees which would naturally start a woodland without any human supervision. That woodland would have been very useful to the Anglo-Saxons, indeed all early farmers. It wasn't dense woodland as we think of woodland now. It was more open woodland where you got space for cattle to go between the trees, or you could take pigs out to forage on the acorns and the beech mast and these sort of things. Even take geese up there, and there was a little bit of evidence that they were doing that. So yeah, it was not just sort of wasteland, it was important grazing, particularly in the years before the invention of hay, and so the limited options for keeping animals through the winter. Woodland pasture was certainly part of that management of animals and the land. We know that people were living there by scant evidence from archaeology. We certainly know people were dying there. There was a very substantial Anglo-Saxon cemetery discovered in the 1970s, just to the north of the Roman town of Vernameton. It was actually when a bridge was being put in across the A46. A little bit of a hurried excavation, but done to a high standard. And both the skeletons themselves and the fairly substantial number of grave goods tell us about life and times in the pagan Anglo-Saxon period. What it also tells us is that the squiggle in the Roman road, where the modern road goes slightly to the east, was actually like a medieval bypass, because those Anglo-Saxon burials were actually placed across and sometimes within the road surface of the Roman road. So when the road went back into use later in the Anglo-Saxon period, they actually avoided the cemetery and went round it. And it's that road, that line, that has been followed since, and it's the route of the modern dual carriageway. The Roman road is running in a dead straight line, but slightly to the west. If you're looking for a landmark, at the time of the excavation there was a cafe near to where the bridge went in. That became both a karting racetrack and, for a number of years, a motel. Motel no longer operates, although the building is still standing. Moving to the centre of the whole of the Leicestershire Wolds, this area known as Six Hills. As I said, there were no hills there. Up to the 18th century, it's shown on maps as Seg's Hill. Well, what does that mean? Almost certainly refers to sedge. And you may say, well, that's a bit odd. Sedge is growing towards the highest part of the ground. But actually, there is a triple SI, Site of Special Scientific Interest, at Six Hills, which is special because of the varieties of sedges and sedge-like plants growing there. So I think they always were, and it's that which gives its name to the central place of the Leicestershire Wolds. We also know that it was the moot site for the Goscott 100. This is an administrative arrangement covering, in this case, a vast area of land through North Leicestershire and across to the east of Leicestershire. And every month, or perhaps a couple of months, the major landowners got together to sort out administrative matters, and they did so at Six Hills. This is another reason why I think that the Vernameton, the especially sacred grove, was either at or very close to Six Hills. It was a traditional moot site. Everybody knew where it was. It was easy enough to get to because it was on the crossroads of two Roman roads. You really couldn't miss it. But there wasn't much there as a landmark. It wasn't known as the Segs Hill 100. I'm not sure why, it could have been, but actually it was known as the Goscott 100. Now what's a Goscott? Well, a cote means a shelter. It becomes the modern word cottage, but it's something pretty rudimentary. It's got a roof on and some walls, but not a lot else. And goss is the Old English word for goose. So this was the 100 moot site that met at the goose shelter. Goose shelters, by and large, were going to be pretty ramshackle and not at all monumental. So I think there was something about this particular Goscott that really stood out. And one possibility is that there was some sort of building there, say a Roman building, possibly a shrine rather than a house, and it was still standing, or at least the walls were. Well, it's fairly easy to put a roof of some sort back on a set of walls, and it would be good enough to shelter the geese overnight and the person looking after the geese from, well, not just foxes, they would be around certainly, but of course there would be also wolves, and this is an area of woodland. We can almost guarantee that there was a significant wolf population in the Leicestershire Wolds at the time that Goscott 100 got its name. So you'd need a fairly substantial shelter to protect your geese and yourself overnight. As I say, the woodland round and about would be excellent for allowing the geese just to wander around and feed themselves. We think this Goscott 100 site stayed into use possibly until the 14th century. The 100 was actually split up into East Goscott and West Goscott, and they had separate moot sites after that. So the exact site is lost, but we do have a reference to a field name, which is the Goosefoot Close. This might be a corruption of Goscott, Goscott to Goosefoot, or it might be a metaphor for a triangular plot of land, a goosefoot-shaped plot of land, where the Goscott 100 might have met. Unfortunately, we have the place name surviving in old documents, but we don't know where this plot of land actually was. Now, as the country converts to Christianity, we get the very early churches appearing somewhere in the very late 6th, early 7th century. They were known at the time as minsters. Best not to think of them as sort of monasteries in any way, but they were mother churches for quite a number of parishes. And because of this, they were spread around at fairly even intervals. And we know that there should have been a minster in this part of North Leicestershire, but we're not quite sure where. But there is an 18th century reference to the ruins of an Anglo-Saxon church that stood there until recently, whatever that really means. And we've also, metal detectorists discovered some little silver strap ends, small decorated pieces of metal, but were only used for one purpose, and that was to go on the end of the leather thongs that tied together the shrouds used for the burial of early Christians. And approximately 11 of these were found in a very small area just to the south of the Roman small town at Vernemeaton, and it fits exactly where the 18th century antiquarian referred to the ruins of the Anglo-Saxon church. So we think we know that there was an Anglo-Saxon church, and it fits. Everything fits. The decoration of these strap ends would suggest that it was an early minster, but it's a little bit tentative. We don't have any documentary references to a church at this site. Other evidence of fairly high status people living in the Leicestershire Wolds come from 3 pieces of jewellery which were discovered by metal detectorists in the early 80s just to the east of Wymeswell village, and they're now in the local museums. They're a little bit damaged in various ways, but they certainly had a real bling factor at the time that they were created in the 8th century. Whoever owned these and was buried with them would have been somebody of some social standing. We've also found various Anglo-Saxon coins in the area, and these so-called shaters, the same period, so people were either making votive offerings at some sort of shrine, or they were accidental losses, but most likely intentionally given to the deities. Right, so let's go back to these place names. First of all, I want to make a distinction between place name elements which describe a settlement and those which don't. And there are 2 types of evidence for settlements in the place names of the Leicestershire Wolds. One is the element ton, as in Burton on the Wolds, Walton on the Wolds, and Thrussington. At the time these places acquired their names, ton indicated some sort of farmstead, possibly more arable than pastoral, but it would probably be mixed. And the word town evolves into the modern word town, but it meant something quite different for the first few centuries it was used. These were just farmsteads of some standing, of central places within the area. The other evidence for settlement we have is the ending by, as in Willoughby and Old Dolby. This is again suggesting some sort of farm, but we know that these names could not have been used before the late 9th century because this is a Scandinavian place name element, and there were no significant numbers of Scandinavians before the late 9th and into the 10th century. The actual word Willoughby on the Wolds, we can recognise willows and so forth. Again, it's a relatively modern word. Dolby, the original spelling of this is Wold Dolby, W-O-L-D, got shortened at some point, in distinction from Great Dolby and Little Dolby down towards the south of Melton. So it was the by, the by, in the Dale, on the Wolds. Just moving around, Ragdale is not a settlement name at all. It refers to a rake, steep-sided ravine, if you like, in the Dale, which is exactly what still survives as the village street comes up north through up towards Six Hills. There's Thrussington, which is somebody's settlement. Seagrave isn't a settlement at all. It's the sacred pool in the sacred wood. So there's an interesting combination of words. I'm afraid the pool and the wood are no longer extant, but that's what the origin of Seagrave comes from. Walton is a very special name because it actually tells us that it was a town settled by the Wales. Who were the Wales? Well, it's the modern word Welsh. It actually suggests that Walton came into existence somewhere around the 6th or certainly the 7th century during the earlier phases of the Anglo-Saxon settlement, and they displaced the Wales, the British-speaking slaves, into their own little township, like South African apartheid here. The Anglo-Saxon settlers were living in the best places, and they pushed the slaves, speaking the strange Brythonic Celtic language, out to a secondary settlement. The Wales lost their identity, they lost their language, and they probably intermarried, and goodness knows what else over the centuries. So the village would have been less distinctive. And then when we had Christianity, part of the parish would have been chopped out for the benefit of the priest at that minster, just to the south of Vernameaton. And so we have part of the wold being for the benefit of the priest, the Prestwold. But then come to the middle of the 9th century, and the Vikings are being an absolute nuisance, trying to raid and do all the rest of it. So King Alfred says we need to set up some fortified garrisons around the country to protect important places. Fortified garrisons were known as burhs. Basically describes the earthworks, the palisades. So there's a settlement founded probably around the 860s called Burton on the Wolds. There are plenty of other Burtons around the country. You can probably think of some examples yourself, but they all date from this same period, around the 860s. There are two others in Leicestershire, one at Burton Lazars, just to the south of Melton Mowbray, and one at Burton Overy, near Great Glen. And those two are clearly protecting the very important trading places and estate centres at Melton and Glen. But interestingly, they're about 2 miles away from the important place. It's as if you've got a bunch of soldiers around, you really don't want them getting bored and drunken on a Saturday night and causing problem in your area, but you want them close enough to send a man on a horse to give them a shout and say, come over here quick. I once gave a version of this talk in Wiltshire, and among the audience were people that had lived in the armoured garrison towns around Salisbury Plain, and there was just a round of laughter came from the audience where I said, you really don't want a bunch of soldiers living right in the middle of your town. So I think Anglo-Saxon soldiers were probably not a lot different to modern day British Army soldiers and so forth. So yes, I think a mile or two away, but not too close, thank you very much. What was the important place that this Burton was protecting? See that bit of parish jutting out to the west like a panhandle? Well, the western boundary of that is Wigley, and that's the course of the River Soar. And it's the course of the River Soar right next to where a modern bridge, but the modern bridge is actually the successor to a medieval bridge and causeway, which crosses the River Soar next to the village of Coates. But before there was a bridge, clearly it was a fording place. And fords are all right if you can get across when the river's not flooded. If not, at Coates there was some handy shelters, cots, to give you a bit of protection while you waited for the water levels to fall. But the Vikings were obviously travelling around in boats, as we're well aware, so they could have come up the Humber estuary, up the Trent, turned left and come up the River Soar. But to get any further up the River Soar, they would have had to cross this fording place, which meant basically getting out your boat and dragging it. Which is fine if you're welcome, because if you're not welcome, you might get a bit of a reception committee. And so if you manage to get upstream and do something a bit untoward, which could be raiding at Barrow-on-Soar, which was a very important trading place at the point, or perhaps gone up the River Reek to Melton, which was also an important market town then, possibly got up to Leicester, and we think the River Soar might have been navigable at this time. But whatever you were doing upstream, if it wasn't all that welcome, word would get about, and then you had to drag your heavily laden boat back over the fording place, and you can pretty much guarantee there will be a welcoming party, and they may make your life rather too difficult. So the garrison at Burton-on-the-Wolds was actually perfectly placed to take an interest, shall we say, in who was going up and down the River Soar. And these fording points are militarily very, very strategically important. So we can see what's happening here. So this same parish, if you like, has three incarnations. It starts off as a Walton, settlement for the slaves, or at least part of it becomes a way of providing an income for the priest. And then it changes tactic again and provides grounds for the garrison to basically feed themselves. Clearly they were not going to be spending all their time fighting off the Vikings. We then come to the north of the parish of Wymswold, which has the biggest village of all the Leicestershire Wolds now, but there's nothing that suggests a settlement at all about the village name. So what's the origin of this? Well, if you read the place name books, they all look at the sort of 11th, 12th century spellings and say, yes, it's named after a chap called Wymond. So it's the wold, the woodland of Wymond. It could be related to a chap who also called Wymond, who had a homestead over at Wymondham, to the east of Leicestershire, actually bordering on Rutland. Well, that's interesting, but it was probably called Wymswold before the 11th, 12th century, in which case it was before the personal name Wymond was actually at all popular. So this is possibly a back formation, that people have forgotten what the original name was and thought it sounded like somebody called Wymond, so it became Wymondham. There's plenty of examples of place names shifting along these lines. So what could it have been before it was Wymond's Wold? Well, a little bit of speculation here, but it could have been the Weomund Wold. And what's a Weomund? Well, a Weo is a pagan shrine or idol. We have a place name just to the north of Wymswold called Weisel, and which also the early forms suggest has this Weo part of it. The place is Weisel, but the early forms are spelt quite differently. And what was a mund? Well, it becomes the modern English word mound, and so it could have been a mound with a shrine or idol on top. But before it meant mound, the word mund was an adjective and it meant protection. Because if you think of something like a burial mound, which of course the Anglo-Saxons were using, it's the mound of earth that protects the burial underneath. But the words shift their meaning, so it changes from protection to meaning the mound itself. So we could have the wold, the woodland, protected by the shrines and idols. Now, it's beyond the scope of this talk to suggest exactly why, but possibly there were these mounds and idols at Six Hills as part of the successor to the Nemeton site, entirely plausible, or maybe there was a whole ring of these Weomunds around the edge of this whole 8 parishes. I'll discuss that in a different talk devoted to Anglo-Saxon shrines. The argument is quite involved and complicated, but I can't prove it, but just possibly Wymswold is a corruption of Weomund Wold, the shrine-protected wold, or just perhaps the shrine mound wold. And then we come finally to Willoughby on the Wolds, which I really think is a name that was probably invented around the 10th century when a village was established there. This is the only name which seems to be contemporary with the nucleated village. Now, I talked about the Wales speaking British or Celtic language, Brythonic language, and there is some evidence from minor place names that this language was used in the area. The evidence is from Murray Lake documents, usually records of farming and so forth, but we have a Cumberdale in Wymswold and a Cumberlee in Seagrave. Both of these come from the Old English word Cumbra, which is the word Cymru, which is, of course, how the Welsh refer to themselves, and not as Wales at all. So this was the dale or the lea, the clearing in the woodland, of the people who called themselves the Cymru. We also have the words Finchit and Trunchit, recorded in Seagrave as late as the 17th century, and they're both from a Welsh word, ced, meaning wood. One of them also includes the early Welsh word trum, which means a promontory, so that's where the Trunchit comes from, the wood on the promontory. We also think that the stream running between Walton and Seagrave was called the Severn, and this is a very common name for watercourses. We have obviously the River Severn down near Bristol and so forth. Interestingly, this is not so much a Celtic language as possibly a pre-Celtic language used by the Celts and, well, of course, still used today in some cases, but not in the Leicestershire Wolds. That name has been lost from normal use. Just looking a little bit more at the influence of Viking place names in the area, a parish to the east of Leicestershire Wolds, which almost chops a little bit out of the original area, we think, is known as Grimston. Now, the ton bit at the end is quite clearly Old English and Anglo-Saxon, but the Grim bit is Scandinavian. It's a nickname. Grimir, it's a nickname for one of the gods, Odin or Uthin, but it was also used by everybody else as well. It actually has the sense of the masked person. Quite what it meant when it was used as a human nickname, it was probably a bit derogatory. On the other side of Grimston, it looks like the original boundaries of the villages of Shoby and Saxby were also, shall we say, messed around with. So chopping out a bit of the Leicestershire Wolds fits in with the general expansion of Grimston. Down at the south of the Leicestershire Wolds, we have the village now known as Thrussington. It's slightly confusing. It's not an entirely Anglo-Saxon name, as the spelling would suggest. Again, it's the tune ending. The older spellings show that the first part is this wonderfully Scandinavian Thorstein, the stone of Thor. Again, it's extended further to the south than you might expect, which means it's chopped out a bit of Rearsby. To the north of Leicestershire Wolds, really just straddling the Leicestershire-Nottinghamshire boundary, somewhere around the 10th century, a new little settlement was planted. It's now known as Thorp in the Glebe. The word Thorp tells us that it's a daughter settlement, almost certainly for arable farming, and it must have chopped out parts of Willoughby and Costock parishes and possibly part of Wymswold as well. Little difficult to establish because it was on heavier clays that weren't really as good for farming as the rest of the area in the later medieval period, not specifically the Black Death, but straddling the 14th century. They give up on using it for arable and it becomes a sheep range, and you're just left with one farm because that's all you need to look after the sheep. And what's left on the ground now is just the humpy bumpy remains of the house platforms and the street in between. It's very well preserved. If you're interested in deserted medieval villages, it is a classic site, and it has been published in an academic journal. But again, evidence of Viking activity here, this creation of Thorps. For reasons that I don't understand, I'm not sure anybody does, when we get the idea of counties being formed in the earlier part of the 10th century, in the Midlands they form around rather central county towns, Leicester for Leicestershire, Nottingham for Nottinghamshire, Derby for Derbyshire, and Lincoln for Lincolnshire. For some reason, Nottinghamshire gets a finger of land coming all the way down to Six Hills. This is the parish of Willoughby on the Wolds. Now, don't be confused by modern parish boundaries because everything got changed around in 1974, and so that finger of land down to Six Hills no longer exists. It became absorbed into Wymswold and Burton parishes. But certainly for many, many centuries it was just this little bit of Nottinghamshire coming all the way down to Six Hills.